Why do some people save and invest while others live paycheck to paycheck? And why do some civilizations flourish for centuries while others collapse in just a few generations? One key factor is time preference, and it shapes everything from personal finance to political systems. In economics, time preference is basically how much people value the present versus the future. It's the tendency to favor immediate rewards over ones that come much later. And humans, by our very nature, tend to prioritize the present because back in our evolutionary past, getting food now instead of later could literally mean life or death. But not everyone does this to the same degree. Some people have a high time preference, meaning they're more about instant gratification. They want what they want right now. Others have a low time preference. They're more patient, willing to put off short term pleasures for bigger rewards down the road. And you can really see this when it comes to, say, money. Someone with a high time preference, they might blow their paycheck on impulse buys, while someone with a low time preference is more likely to save and invest. And this shifts over time too. Younger people in general have higher time preferences. Like if you're a teenager with your first job, you're probably more focused on enjoying that money right now rather than, say, saving for retirement. But as people get older or take on more responsibilities, like, say, having kids, their time preference usually drops. They might suddenly think about things like college funds, home ownership, or building long term wealth. Now, to actually measure this concept, economists use something called discount functions. These functions calculate something called a discount factor, which is basically a number between 0 and 1 that tells us how much of a future reward is worth today. Let's look at a simple example using the present value formula, which is basically expressed as this: present value equals future value times the discount factor. Say you're expecting $100 in the future and your discount factor is zero point 0.9, then the present value of that money is $90. But if your discount factor is like zero point 0.5, that means you'd only value that $100 as if it were worth $50 today. So the lower the discount factor, the more someone is present oriented. There are two main ways economists model this: exponential discounting, which assumes a steady rate of devaluation over time, kind of like rational long term planning, and then hyperbolic discounting, which is a bit more human. It reflects our tendency to strongly favor short term rewards right now and then be more patient about rewards that are further in the future. And time preferences aren't just about age. They also vary based on things like income, IQ, and culture. But here's where it gets really interesting when you zoom out and look at collective time preferences. Because when you add up all these little individual choices, you start to see how entire societies are shaped by them. This is where economist and philosopher Hans-Hermann Hoppe comes in. In his book, Democracy, The God That Failed, he argues that civilization advances when societies cultivate lower time preferences, when people think more about the future, that is. And he ties this to actual historical shifts in our evolution. Think about early humans, right? They were nomadic hunters and gatherers, taking from nature without ever really giving back, a sort of parasitic lifestyle. That lifestyle naturally encouraged high time preferences. Survival was all about the present. But then agriculture came along, and suddenly people had to plan ahead. They had to think about storing food for winter, managing land, and long-term survival. That shift laid the groundwork for, well, everything: science, culture, civilization itself, even. But Hoppe also warns about the reverse process, what he calls decivilization. He argues that when governments and institutions encourage high time preferences, when they make it more rewarding to focus on the now instead of the future, society starts to unravel a bit. So, for example, inflation erodes the value of savings, making people more likely to spend rather than invest. Welfare programs, while typically well intentioned, can sometimes discourage long term planning by removing personal responsibility. And according to Hoppe, democracies actually make this problem worse because politicians, well, they think in terms of short election cycles. They focus on quick fixes and policies that win votes now, even if they hurt long term stability. Hoppe contrasts this with monarchy, specifically the type of monarchy that existed in early Western Europe. Now, he's not saying monarchy is perfect, but he argues that it tends to encourage lower time preferences. The reason why is because a king sees the realm as his property, something to be passed down to his heirs. So he has a personal incentive to think long term to make sure the country stays stable and prosperous. Whereas democratic leaders, they're just temporary caretakers extracting from the system and more concerned about personal gain. They don't own the country, so their focus is way more short term. That said, Hoppe's real vision isn't monarchy. It's a completely stateless, voluntary society. He believes that in a system based entirely on private property and voluntary cooperation, people would have the lowest time preferences possible. They'd be able to plan for the future without government interference, without unpredictable policy changes messing things up. Time preference isn't just an abstract economic concept. It's like a lens for understanding why people make the choices they do. It shapes personal habits, financial decisions, and even entire civilizations. And whether or not you agree with Hoppe's analysis, his ideas push us to rethink the systems we live under by framing them in terms of time preference. Take care.